Hi everyone and welcome back to Stephan Livera podcast. Joining me today is Jungly. He is working on P2Pool V2 as well as Hydropool. Now, some people may know Jungly earlier was working on some braid pool stuff as well. So Jungly, welcome to the show and thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thanks, Stephan. It's good to be here.
So Jungly, give us just a quick overview. What's the kind of the main focus? Like, why are you working on this stuff?
That's a great question. Why am I working on this stuff? So when I discovered Bitcoin, it was like it took me a while to get my head around, and I kind of was looking because I have a PhD in distributed systems, and I was kind of motivated to look at what I could bring to the table for Bitcoin, right? And of course, there is stuff that you can do on the core protocol itself. But lo and behold, the mining decentralization seemed like a big, interesting topic to look at. And I'll be honest with you, I think some of the talks by Bob McIlrath on Braidpool were kind of very inspiring. And also Chris Belcher's work on using Lightning payouts for scaling or kind of rebooting P2Pool. That was how I kind of got into the rabbit hole of how we could help it, or what are the challenges in centralized mining and how can we actually fix it.
So you see it as we need to help decentralize mining further, right? And so I guess I'll just offer a very quick explanation because, again, we're going to do our best to make this accessible for the non-technical listeners. So we're going to do our best to explain any jargon so that people can follow along. So in Bitcoin, you can buy mining machines and you can plug them in and you can just mine today. But there's a reason why nowadays most people mine with a pool. And the main reason I would say is because they want to smooth out the variation, right? That variability, right? Because if you just plug in, a solo, mining, you may not get a payout ever, right? In your lifetime. Yeah. And so that's kind of why people, go together with these pools and point their hash rate towards a pool. And then that pool does payouts for them. But the concern, as I'm sure you can help explain in a better way than I can, is that today is a bit more centralized. And so do you want to explain a little bit and elaborate a bit on the earlier iterations of P2Pool and then what are you trying to do now that's better?
Yeah, absolutely. So P2Pool originally came out, I think 2013 or 14, I think 13, all the way back. And there was a girl called Forrest, and I can't pronounce his second name, Voigt. And the idea was that instead of a centralized pool, which kind of builds the templates and controls the payouts and does the accounting in a kind of opaque way, how can we make it decentralized, like use the principles of Bitcoin to run a pool, which is like, let's build a share chain on the side, which they call the side chain or a share chain, which was essentially weaker Bitcoin blocks, right? Blocks that had enough proof of work to get into the peer-to-peer, P2Pool side chain, but were not strong enough to get into the Bitcoin chain itself. It was a linear chain with a block time of 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, there was a block, so much faster than Bitcoin blocks. And this share chain kind of had how much work different miners had done by virtue of just having the blocks that the miners had submitted. And you could look back at whatever window you wanted. I think they looked back at 3 Bitcoin blocks window, and looking at how many shares different miners had, they could go, okay, this is the proportion of the payout that you're going to get paid. And the way the payout was happening was depending on what the last window was. When new jobs were created, they looked at the last window, figured out what the proportions were, and put the payments directly into Coinbase, right?
So,
for all the miners.
Just to explain there as well. So in general, when mining, the way it works is mining rewards happen in what's known as a Coinbase, transaction, which is normally the first one in every block. And there's certain rules about it. I think, you can't spend it for 100 blocks or something like this. And what you're referring to there is this idea that in the early days of P2Pool, the miners were getting paid out directly into the Coinbase transaction. Whereas today, let's say in most of the pools that exist today, or basically all the large pools that exist today, it's a custodial payout model. So do you want to just explain a bit about that?
Yeah. So in the custodial payout model, for example, if you look at Antpool, right? So the mining rewards go to one address, which is essentially controlled by the pool operator. So Antpool in this example. And then later on, depending on the work distribution that they've seen in their local database, they then later pay out people once they've reached a minimum threshold. But that's another detail. We can leave that. But they pay out the people from their custodian wallets. So they're not getting payout directly from the Virgin coins quote unquote, from the Coinbase. Instead, they take those coins and then they have whatever mechanics they use to manage their finances. And then people are paid out after a few, I don't know what the exact payout frequency is, but it depends on the minimum threshold that people need to reach. So whereas P2Pool was trying to do, okay, we don't want anybody to custody it because who's going to custody it, right? So instead, all the miners, suppose there were 20 miners, all the 20 miners would have one payout in the Coinbase. So there'll be essentially 20 outputs in the Coinbase in proportion to the work they have done in the past. And all the other normal rules apply, that the Coinbase cannot be spent for another 100 blocks or something, which is about a day. So that's what P2Pool was trying to do. And it actually lasted from 2013 all the way till, I think the last block was 2018 or 17. Yeah. They forked to support SegWit, but then after that, it was kind of on a downward spiral. And there's a number of reasons for that.
Yeah. Okay. And so can you explain a little bit about some of the limitations there and where this concept of P2Pool V2, which is what you're working on, where does that come in?
Yeah, sure. So what happened with P2Pool was there's a couple of problems and one kind of controversial problem. So I'll go to the two core technical problems, right? One is the Coinbase payouts were eating up into the block space, right? Suppose you had 500 miners. If you had 500 outputs in the Coinbase, you're just eating up space in the Bitcoin block, which you could have earned some fees from by including other transactions. So this was an interesting problem, and Chris Belcher kind of actually in the same post where he was talking about how to scale P2Pool, he looked at the numbers, and in 2017 his calculations based on that time's fees rates and that time subsidy were that if you have 500 or so miners on the pool, it becomes not profitable to or it doesn't make sense to take more block space to add another 50 miners. So you can imagine with only 500 miners, the pool can only scale so much, and therefore the variance would start to go up. So this was the fundamental problem. That is why we need more outputs in the Coinbase so that we can get more miners into the pool so that we can have a higher hash rate and thus lower variance. So that was the problem number one. The other problem was, which is the complexity of the P2Pool setup itself was challenging people. But the biggest problem was that because it was a linear chain and there was one block every 30 seconds, there's only so many slots that you could fit into a day, right? So if there were large miners, they would take up all the slots, and the small miners would not be able to get their shares into the chain at all. And what was happening was there was latency games being played, like if people were tightly connected in the P2Pool network and you were not tightly connected in that quote unquote cabal, then you'd basically be your shares would propagate slowly, and therefore they would be orphaned out. Like other people will not build on your chain, on your share.
Gotcha. And I guess I'll just interject here. This is like a big deal around network propagation. This is like a big deal in mining centralization. And so there's a lot of work being done around this to try to minimize that delay. Because the concern, and whether it's P2Pool or just Bitcoin generally, the concern is, look, if the network centralizes into a certain area, right? I guess an analogy might be if people think about like Flash Boys or these kinds of examples where these high frequency traders, they're all trying to centralize to be really close to the exchange, and it matters. Like a few milliseconds is a huge difference for them. It made a huge difference to their profitability. And just like that, in Bitcoin mining, it's a similar thing where, let's say, developers and people looking at this at a protocol level are doing their utmost to make sure the propagation delays are minimal so that miners can be all around the world and not imagine the extreme kind of hypothetical of every Bitcoin miner has to all be set up in the one building in order to be competitive. That would be a big problem for us because then that's a centralization vector, right? So then you're explaining how this applies not just at Bitcoin, but even at the P2Pool level, that because of this propagation delay, it is creating a problem in terms of stale blocks or orphan rate. Can you explain a bit there?
Yeah, so orphan would be so they had two issues. They also had a marketing branding problem here because one was orphan shares, which people understood. And the other was they used to call them dead on arrival, which was basically the shares arrived so late that we won't even validate them. They're just dead on arrival, right? Basically, they're so late. They're so far behind the time. But this problem as you said, also exists in Bitcoin. And the big concern is that you can't, the gains from putting all the world's miners in one building with one mining pool, it'll be difficult to beat that centralization. Thankfully, it has practical limitations to do that, so we're not seeing that happen yet. But then because of this, the developers in Bitcoin were concerned about it, rightly, and this idea of the compact block stuff came along, and I think this is very directly relevant in P2Pool V2 because this didn't exist in the old P2Pool, which actually shrinks the block size from, like, say, whatever it is, 4 megabytes to 20 to 30 kilobytes, right? So they're smaller shares, they can be transmitted fast, and they can be transmitted quickly. And there are other optimizations we can do at a network layer, which I'm not going to dig into either here or actually in my first MVP, which is like, instead of transmitting using TCP, we can, this is a technical details, we can use, some things like Quick and UDP, which is built on UDP. So it's even faster to transmit the blocks, propagate the blocks. So these were the kind of two challenges, right? One, the share orphan rate was getting high because the share chain was linear. And two, the Coinbase could only include so many miners so that, there was a kind of a cap on the scalability of the pool itself. So these were the two challenges. The third one then, it is often said that some hardware manufacturers, no, this is true, but some hardware manufacturers put a size limit on the Coinbase. So basically you could only fit 18 or 20, I don't know how many Coinbases could we fit in. And that resulted in an insta death for P2Pool because suddenly you couldn't even dream of putting 100 or 500 Coinbase outputs there. You just were limited to 20. Now, it seems like that that has moved on. Like, the modern machines don't have that anymore, but there are some old machines out there which still have this limitation. But however, anyway, this was a problem because it directly impacted P2Pool. And if we build a solution, we should be mindful that this is an attack vector. We should kind of not let that happen.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. And so the other big obvious question people will have is, if they're following the mining world, they may have heard of DATUM or SV2. So DATUM is the protocol associated with Ocean, and SV2, I guess nowadays there's Demand Pool, who are doing, let's say, full SV2. And so these are other ideas of decentralizing block template creation. But how would P2Pool V2 compare with DATUM or SV2?
Yeah, so this is a cool question, and it's probably the question that most people will have. The way I see it is, DATUM and SV2 are excellent tools for helping centralized pools, right? What I mean by centralized pools is they do the accounting, right? The accounting is not transparent unless they open the windows, which very few have in the past. I think only Brains kind of try to do something in that direction. So accounting is closed, and secondly, the payout is still controlled by those centralized pools, right? So just like in all the centralized pools, as we talked about, the payment goes to one Coinbase and then they split it out. Now, Ocean does something slightly different there, but all the SV2 pools will probably have that. So I think these are great tools to kind of slightly increase the decentralization of the centralized pools, which is like, okay, at least you can build the templates.
Yeah. And just for clarity for listeners, what we mean there when you say build the template, what we mean there is individual miners can craft and put transactions into a block template for potential inclusion, right? Rather than people just, let's say, pointing their hash rate to a mining pool and just saying, okay, mining pool, Mr. Ant Pool or Foundry or whatever, you just decide whatever you want to go in the block. Whereas the idea here is with DATUM and SV2, or full SV2 support, the individual miner or hasher per se has some say there. He can choose, this transaction and not that one, or whatever. But to your point, Jungly, P2Pool V2, the idea is to improve on that even further by not just having the template construction be done at the individual mining level, but also the share accounting and the payout to be non-custodial. These are the main differences, yeah?
Absolutely. Also because, if the payment is controlled by a centralized pool, then they still have a stick with which they can police you, right? They can say, can you build your templates as long as X, Y, Z, right? Because in SV2, there is a protocol, which is the job negotiation protocol, where the idea is that if I'm the miner, I build a template, then I say to the pool, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And then they say, okay, you can skip that, which is, I think they also have introduced this, that you can skip this later on. But the problem still remains that even if I do the work and later when I find a block, they go, okay, but we don't like this block, so we're not going to pay you, right? Or whatever. Or we find a share and you say, okay, I'm not going to pay you for these shares. So there is still a control in the centralized pool operator, right? Which by virtue of being centralized is always a potential attack vector. So we wanted to
this is kind of like a don't be evil versus a can't be evil kind of idea of like
absolutely
in the like now to be clear, P2Pool V2 is not like live and operational yet. So obviously the aim is to sort of further help decentralize, but in terms of what exists today, things like DATUM and SV2 are probably that's at least that's what we have today.
They step in the right direction for sure, right? Absolutely. So go on.
Okay, go on. So then the interesting. Okay, so can you give us just a sense of? I know this is what you're working on, right? With P2Pool V2. Can you give us a sense of what would be needed to change here? Like, does this require any kind of Bitcoin soft fork, or is it more just this is software that miners would run to participate in P2Pool V2?
Yeah. So, I mean, looking back at, the best way to answer this question is why are we able to reboot P2Pool now and say that this can scale and won't have the problems that original P2Pool had? I think the good thing is initially I thought that maybe some soft forks will help. But if you look back, essentially we can scale the linear chain problem by kind of having those uncle blocks that you kind of alluded to in the beginning. And the idea there is that instead of having one slot every 30 seconds, whatever the frequency is, I think we can actually, because of faster internet now, we can actually have a faster frequency. And I've run some simulations in that direction. But we can have a faster block time, but let's stick with 30. But at each 30-second interval, we just don't have one slot. But essentially, if we introduce 3 uncles, we can have 4 slots, right? So you basically quadruple the amount of space that is on the chain at every 30-second interval, right?
Yeah, but just to be clear, sorry, just to answer the earlier question, no, it's not a soft fork to Bitcoin, and it would be software that individual miners would run. But it's maybe using some other techniques to deal with, as we spoke, and we'll get into that, like the share chain and the atomic swaps part of it.
Sorry,
right?
I'm jumping around then. Yeah, I'm sorry. So no, we don't need a soft fork. Any soft fork would essentially help us if we go with any of the soft forks that help
like
Lightning.
a CTV and these kinds of things would all help.
They directly help us too, because then we can use even smarter ways to do the payout management.
Gotcha. But to be clear, it does not require a soft fork, but a soft fork would help, right? In terms of these covenant soft forks and things. Okay. And then so we've got these other concepts that we need to dig into. So this share chain and the whole uncles concept, and then the atomic swaps thing. So maybe let's start with the share chain. So you were touching on that. So can you elaborate a little bit? What is a share chain? How does it work? Okay. And then we can kind of get into like what you're doing that's new.
Yeah. Sorry, I jumped there because I thought that this is what we're doing. So share chain is essentially the chain of weaker blocks that P2Pool maintains, right? And all the miners who are running are members of P2Pool can run the P2Pool software locally on their mining site, or like in the original P2Pool, what happened was there were some remote nodes that were serving a bunch of mining sites. But let's leave that aside. So all the P2Pool nodes maintain a blockchain, a side chain, a share chain, which is of much weaker Bitcoin blocks. Now, in P2Pool original, it was just a linear chain. And we are trying to scale that up using the uncle block mechanism, which I kind of alluded earlier.
Gotcha. And I guess maybe for people who aren't familiar, like what is an uncle block? What is this concept? As I have a very loose understanding of it, is that actually it kind of came kind of from like shitcoin land and like Ethereum and stuff like that, where basically the idea was, again, this network propagation concern. And the idea was they wanted to kind of give some incentive for the like orphan or stale blocks, something like this. Is that's kind of my very loose understanding. Can you explain a bit further?
So essentially what they did was to reduce the number of orphans, they would say, okay, up to 3 orphans we allow in the chain, and we call them uncle blocks, right? Which is essentially your parent block's siblings, right? So when you mine a new block, you point to them. Okay, you basically not just only point to your parent block, but also up to 3 other uncle blocks.
I see.
Okay,
and then this is that what you were saying. It's not just a linear chain now. It's like it's kind of, that's where you were talking about this DAG, this what's it called, decentralized acyclic, what's it called?
Directed acyclic graph.
Sorry, directed acyclic
So there's no
graph.
cycles in the graph, and it's directed, like all the edges
Okay.
have direction. So what that does is it gives us the opportunity to scale out the chain itself. Now, the good thing with Uncle Blocks is, yes, it came from shitcoin land, but because it came from a shitcoin, which was kind of popular, a lot of academics and a lot of people studied it. So it's been studied to death, and we kind of know what are the weaknesses of the approach, what are the strengths of the approach, and we can kind of wisely choose the parameters that we want, right? Thanks to all the research gone into that. Interestingly, Ethereum essentially has stopped with Uncle Blocks since this went to proof of stake. So
right, yeah. And I mean, hey, look, the research was done.
Yeah,
if there's a benefit to Bitcoin that comes from it, great.
We take it for sure, absolutely. That's the attitude we need to have. So this is what we need to do, and in Ethereum there was another scheme which kind of which had allowed for some shenanigans, which was that the transactions in the Uncle Blocks were also taken into account, right?
All right, so it's even more complicated. Okay.
Yeah. So what we want to do is kind of leave that complication aside. I mean, I'm getting into the weeds here, but we kind of ignore the transactions in the Uncle Blocks and just take it for the proof of work accounting for the PPLNS solution, right? As to how much work people have done. And the only transactions that go into are the main chain ones, right? So that kind of simplifies even further the challenges in kind of deploying Uncle Blocks to this solution. So that's where kind of the transition from old P2Pool to P2Pool V2 is on the sharechain side of things.
This episode is brought to you by CoinKite, the makers of my favorite Bitcoin hardware wallet, the Cold Card Q. Now, some people think self-custody is too hard, but it's really about taking responsibility for your Bitcoin wealth and understanding that self-custody gives you a true feeling of liberty. The Cold Card Q has a full keyboard and big screen. It's got 2 secure elements and a true air gap, allowing you to go fully air-gapped using QR codes from seed generation to transaction signing. You can power the device using 3 AAA batteries, so you don't even have to plug it into the wall for power. You can easily use it with Sparrow Wallet for PC or Nunchuck on mobile, and you can dial it into the right level of security and complexity that you choose. If you want a simple setup, just use 12 words and single signature. If you want passphrases, easy. If you want to add multi-sig or co-signing features, you've got those too. So go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get 10% off on your cold card or other devices and level up your self-custody today. Okay, and so in simple terms, it's like saying that, from referencing some of your slides, you're saying here, uncles are paid for work done. Can you explain a little bit about that? Like this concept and how we use this in P2Pool V2? Or how you're planning to? Yeah.
So the problem was in the original P2Pool, all the orphan blocks didn't get any payouts, right? And in fact, I'll be honest here, the motivation to do this also comes from Monero's P2Pool. Right. So Monero has a P2Pool out there, which is kind of successful. And they have like three instances of it, depending on the hash rate. They call it P2Pool, P2Pool Mini, P2Pool Nano, or something like that. But they've shown that with the Uncle Blocks, they were able to scale the chain out. So your question was how and what does it mean by
uncles are being paid for work done? Yeah.
So essentially, if you get into the chain as an Uncle Block, right, you get the payouts for your work as well, right? In the original P2Pool design, orphan blocks were just completely abandoned. So if you were late by a few milliseconds to propagate, you would not get any
too bad,
payouts.
so sad, you know?
Yeah. And miners correctly were like, okay, why am I not being taken into account, and this and that, the other. So what we want to do is any block that makes it as an Uncle Block also get the payout appropriate to the proof of work in that block, right?
Okay, so it's like a proportional sort of share thing, or what? How does that work?
So there is something you can play with as to, so the payout is pay per last n shares, okay? PPLNS, right? So what we do is, say n comes out to be 1 million blocks. You look at 1 million blocks chain in the past, including all the uncles. So you count them like that way. And then you kind of see which miner has done how much work. Suppose there's one miner who has 500,000 blocks in there, he'll get 50% of the payout. Okay. If there's someone who has like only say 10,000, whatever, it's like 1% of the payout there. So it's directly proportional. I'm not trying to do anything fancy there. What I'm trying to do is leave accounting as a separate crate. So this is all built in Rust. So we leave it as a separate, as a crate with a nice interface, so that if people want to experiment with different payout mechanisms, they can, right? For me, it'll be simple pay per last 10 shares and, go on with that.
I see. And so just so I understand what's happening here, the idea with P2Pool V2 is all the miners who want to participate in this P2Pool V2, they will run this software, and by doing this, they are participating in the share accounting themselves. And the way they do this is through this share chain, which, as you said, let's say gives some shares or does some payouts for these uncles, which are actually orphans, which didn't end up counting in the end, but they're kind of being paid to kind of incentivize them to participate in P2Pool V2. And the idea is it kind of all evens out in the long run anyway if you stay participating.
If you keep mining, yeah. I mean, there is slight bonus we need to give to people who include uncle blocks, because otherwise there is an incentive to not include the uncle blocks. I mean, this is kind of slight details there, but for every uncle block you get like a 1% boost or something, just because you are encouraged to include uncle blocks. Otherwise, I would say I don't want to give the other miner a chance to get more payout.
Which again comes back to what we were saying, these issues around network propagation, and it's kind of like a game theory sort of thing of like we want to encourage participation. I guess that's kind of the idea, right?
Yeah. But the parameters here as to the number of blocks and the payout boost to give to people who include to blocks that include the uncle blocks or refer back to the uncle blocks, that has all been well studied. It's been well published. There's been some simulations, there's been mathematical models. So we just take the most sensible approach there and stick it in, right? That's what we're doing at the moment. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're just taking what has happened in the space over the last 10 years and take the best practices and put them in there.
I see. Yeah. Okay. And so then, I mean, look, at the end of the day, that this is one of the big benefits, right? As we were saying, a lot of the other pool models, or basically many of them, almost all of them are centralized in some way, whereas this is actually a decentralized pool model. So that's probably the big win. That's the big 0 to 1 thing here, that you can have a decentralized pool in a way that allows shares from other people, not just yourself, right? Because theoretically, if you were like some massive mega miner with like, you could maybe be a solo miner. In that sense, you're kind of choosing your own templates and everything. But in this sense, it's a decentralized pool where people are chipping in. So I guess probably the obvious question people will have is, how far does it go? Like, how many people could participate in this share chain? Yeah. Does it take it from like 20 up to like 100 or 1,000, or like what's the rough number?
Yeah. So one cap was basically this cap on the number of shares, right? The second cap is, of course, the payout mechanism, which we can get to later, how we scale that up. So let's assume there is no cap because of that. Then the cap comes down to how much data we want people to be able to download and process.
Yeah.
Right. In a sensible way, so that they're not lagging too far behind. So I kind of worked through numbers of saying, okay, I was first aiming for a 10,000 node P2Pool, right? So at least 10,000 P2Pool nodes. And remember, each node is probably serving 100 machines or 1,000 machines or whatever, right? So, or 20 machines or 5 machines, depending on the scale of the miner. But we want at least, so I worked these numbers out, and basically my goal is if we can have, not being very humble, but say if you want 1% hash rate, right? that's like this much of the.
Was that like 10 exahash today or something? I don't know.
It's more than a zeta, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, but 1% would be
Yeah.
But go on.
10, yeah. So basically, let's say each node is handling 1,000 S19s or S21s or whatever, right? Then to get to 1% of the hash rate, if we have 1,000 node P2Pool network, we are able to get there. So this is I'm kind of working from numbers of, okay, what is sufficient to get some blocks at a decent variance, right? So that miners are happy to join this pool. Then it comes down, okay, if we have 1,000 network pool, we can actually make it work. We can, one detail that one advantage we have from P2Pool original is that we have the compact block technology available now, right? So which we are implementing, which is the idea that the P2Pool shares, the share chain is kind of propagated using compact blocks. And that basically helps us figure out that if we assume a 300 millisecond latency, which is kind of the larger end of the latency, and we ran some simulations that we have 1,000 pool network and 1,000 node network, and we are generating shares at 10-second interval, right? Instead of 30-second interval. So it's a much faster share rate than original P2Pool. So basically we have more capacity in the chain. Then the number of uncle blocks were 1 in 10,000, right? A number of orphans. So we have very low orphan rate, which is what we are looking for. So what we want to get to is, with the TLDR is, to get a 1% hash rate, 1,000 pool network with an average size of 1,000 machines, we can make it happen, right? If we have an average miner size of 10, then we need much larger P2Pool network, right?
Okay,
to get to 1% hash
but
rate.
I guess just considering the share chain side of it, not the Coinbase output limit, atomic swap side of this, just for now, just considering the share chain side of it, what is the rough like upper limit for now that you see? Is it like 10,000? Is that the upper limit of
the 10,000 is the
Sorry, go on.
how many P2Pool node instances is what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, is that the number, like roughly?
Well, I mean, 1,000 is completely doable. That I'm pretty confident of. But I think 10,000 would require a bit more effort from us to figure out how we can make that work, given the hardware constraints, because we don't want people to require a server, right?
Okay, gotcha.
A machine of like...
so we're in that ballpark. Let's say 1,000 to 10,000 is kind of, that's the ballpark of what you think is feasible of how many people could participate in P2Pool V2. That's the number, roughly?
Yeah.
From a share chain perspective only.
From the share chain perspective. This is the kind of... that's the kind of number we are targeting for at the moment, right? I mean, there are other optimizations possible, but let's not go into that. This is the kind of more humble numbers that we're going for. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's... And I guess the other question is, can there be multiple instances of P2Pool V2?
Exactly.
Right? Could there be like... Jungly's P2Pool V2 and Stephan's P2Pool V2, and they could each have 1,000 different miners on them, as an example.
In fact, that's what I mean, this is where I think some other efforts in this space differ from my approach, which is like in the original P2Pool as well, there was more than one instance, right? There were some private pool instances that we didn't know about. If you look at Monero's solution, they basically have a P2Pool for larger miners and another P2Pool for smaller miners, and an even smaller P2Pool for even smaller miners. So nothing stops you from having multiple P2Pool instances. In fact, I think you could think of it like there's Bitcoin and there's Bitcoin Cash, right? There's P2Pool and there's other P2Pool networks. In fact, my motivation also comes from I was on some Discords hanging out, and people would come along and say, look, I have a bunch of friends. We're like 5 people. And we'd like to run a pool together, right? Can we use your software to do that? And of course, there doesn't exist any solution out there to do it, right? So if you, and there are
except
people
for now, I know there's an idea. I did an episode with Evan about hash pools, but that's that's an eCash based model, which is arguably not as decentralized as this.
Yeah, I mean, this one you could use P2Pool, but also, I mean, circling to a little bit to, we're shipping part of P2Pool as Hydropool, which is like a standalone PPLNS centralized mining pool software, right? So you can fire it up, right? And all your mates could connect to it, and off you go. And you get PPLNS payouts. Simple PPLNS payouts, no rocket science involved there, none of those eCash tokens or any complication, things like that. No lightning payouts, just simple Coinbase payouts for a bunch of lads who want to kind of share their resources together to mine together without paying 2-3% fees to any other pool. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. And so I guess the other thing is, so just keeping it simple for now, let's say there's only one P2Pool V2 instance out there. Let's say you're hosting it, or someone takes it on to kind of host it.
Well, no one's hosting it, right? Everybody's hosting it.
Because we're all kind of talking to each other,
it's like,
right?
Who hosts Bitcoin?
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, that's a good point. I maybe my mental model is a bit off there. But my point is more like, how would you... Okay, so in that example where there are 2 or 3 instances, how would you choose which one you connect to? Like, I guess that's coming back to what you were saying, like Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash or whatever. Like, you would just have...
I think it comes down to...
Would you need a different way to differentiate for them to kind of know who is on what network, this kind of thing?
I think the most important thing there would be to know what your hash rate is. and what is the hash rate of other people on the network. So suppose there's a P2 pool with like people with 1 exahash, and you're going there with like your 2 terahash or whatever machines. You shouldn't join there because you probably won't get enough shares to get payouts, right? So there's probably another P2 pool instance out there which is for 2 to 10 terahash machines, right? Whatever, right? On people with like a small setup.
So you could see it like segregating out by kind of weight class, let's say. Yeah. You're in the heavyweight class, you're the featherweight or whatever, flyweight. I
like that naming terminology. I might actually steal that. Heavyweight versus featherweight.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, I mean, I guess we've spoken, that's kind of the share chain side of things. Let's now talk about the payout side of things. So, as I understand, you've got this model of atomic swaps for payouts, and the idea is that you might do lightning and swapping in and out to... so coming back to what we were saying, there were two main obstacles. One was the Coinbase output limit, and then the other was the orphan rate. So I guess the share chain side of it is like the orphan rate thing, and then now dealing with the Coinbase output limit. Can you explain a bit about this atomic swaps concept and how that works?
Yeah. So the MVP that we're going to ship is simply paying out directly from the Coinbases. That'll be simple and easy, right? But one thing that we're doing is also, which is different from the original P2 pool, is to have full transaction support. Right. Okay. So UTXO based, script based transactions. And we're able to do all this because Bitcoin's ecosystem has come a long way since P2 pool existed. Right. You use Rust Bitcoin and you get a lot of stuff out of the box. Right. And so I love these projects that have been going around in Bitcoin space. They really give you the tools to build stuff fast. So we use Rust Bitcoin to kind of support transaction system on the peer-to-peer pool share chain, so that now, so there was a Coinbase output on the Bitcoin block, but the Bitcoin block, imagine, is being wrapped around by the P2 pool block itself, right? And that P2 pool block has a Coinbase output, which is basically identifying that this block was mined by, say, Jungly, and therefore it has an output paying Jungly. Okay, so there's a simple UTXO pay to public key hash output there. So everybody will have their own P2 public key hash output in their block that they mine, right? In their P2 pool block that they mine. So now, what if we were able to transact between these, right? So what we could say is we limit the number of outputs that go into the Coinbase because we don't want to kind of eat too much block space.
Consume the whole block based out of Coinbase inputs and outputs.
Or be vulnerable to some hardware manufacturers going only one allowed, right? So we basically have, say, a limit of 20 outputs there. So the top 20 miners, which is like in the payout mechanism, we figure out these are the top 20 guys, and they get paid out indirectly in the Coinbase. Now the other guys are still sitting around with their UTXOs on the P2 pool share chain, right? And they're like, okay, I have some work here. I have proof here. It's in the share chains and it is a spendable transaction. What can we do with this? So in fact, Blue Matt came up with this idea and it took me a while to figure this out. And it came to him instinctively. And it took me like a whole night of chatting with him to figure out what he was talking about. The idea is very simple. I hope I can convey it simply, right? Which is that if I have an output on the share chain, I can just do an atomic swap with someone else on the Bitcoin chain, right? So the large miner has some Bitcoin sitting somewhere on the Bitcoin chain, or a UTXO on the Bitcoin chain, and I have a UTXO on the P2 pool share chain. So we do an atomic swap, either on chain or off chain, which basically says, this output I'm going to spend and it's going to belong to you. So it's going to say, you're one of the bigger miners. This is now, I spend it to Stephan. So now Stephan has that UTXO. And in return, I get an appropriate amount of Bitcoin UTXO, right? Okay. And we do a simple atomic swap based on the atomic swap systems that exist out there. And the beauty of it all is we don't even need to do it on chain. We can directly do it on Lightning. Off chain. And this is the part, off chain. This is the part kind of I struggled with. And I think talking to people working in the Lightning space, this is kind of very sensible. It's kind of doable. In fact, we got a Summer Bitcoin guy who really did a lot of effort, and there's a PR waiting for me to merge, which actually does this stuff. So,
gotcha. I guess I'll just quickly jump in. The concept of atomic swaps for people is like this idea of either both sides of this trade go through or none of it goes through. And in Bitcoin and Lightning ecosystem, there are people using some of these atomic swaps, or even like I think Exchange and some of these other, like the way they structure these up is so that one side has to he has to do like a hash of a pre-image, and then in order to unlock on the other side, he needs the pre-image to that hash, which is the thing that came before that hash, to be able to unlock on the other side. And so that's how they sort of make it so that either both sides of the trade go through or none of it. And that's this concept of atomicity. So that's, I guess, an interesting concept that can be leveraged here with like lightning swaps and things like this.
Yeah. In fact, I've been told, I still haven't reached out to Boltz people, but I've been told instead of building it, we could just use Boltz. And I'm open to both ideas, to be honest. I don't mind building it, but at the same time, we need to figure out what miners think about Boltz, going through the Boltz exchange mechanism. So, I mean, this is becoming an industry standard, like the atomic swap, off-chain atomic swap in Bitcoin, which is absolutely amazing to see, right? People just are accepting it so easily now.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe there's, I don't know, this is beyond, above my pay grade, but maybe there are kind of more fancy, maybe you come out with like an MVP, but there are more fancy things that people could have, like an ARC wallet, or like some kind of liquid swap thing, or Lightning, I don't know, some kind of swap into one of the, or Spark, I don't know, one of these things, they could swap into one of those and just kind of have a wallet that gets these, and then they can batch it up that way. And then when they want to go on-chain on their side, then they can exit out on-chain or stay inside of that ecosystem of ARC, Spark, Lightning, or eCash or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, we're going with Lightning because it seems to be the most stable ecosystem, but I have had conversations with people from ARC, and it's totally doable there too. But as you said, we just do an MVP, and I'm sure some people will take it and build it for ARC or build it for as all the other things that exist now. It's kind of, the ecosystem is exploding. You can't keep pace with it. Yeah. So once we have the infra in place, once we show that it's possible, then there is a desire for people to adopt it. I'm pretty sure other solutions will come along for the layer 2 swaps.
Okay, so just summarizing a little bit on the atomic swaps component of this. The idea is that the miners control their UTXOs on the P2Pool V2 sharechain, not like, because we're dealing in the P2Pool V2, and then they can use this swap to swap out into Lightning as an example. Yeah. And the point is now it's a non-custodial mining pool, which is a big difference from mining pools that exist today. That's the big kind of takeaway, I guess. Obviously, these are, let's say, optimistic or very, let's say, ambitious visions, but certainly it's a cool idea, and I think it's well worth people kind of exploring and seeing, can this really be done? Yeah. So can you maybe explain for us, like, where are you at so far with P2Pool V2? And just give us people an update there.
Yeah. So in the first iteration, I was trying to build on top of CK Pool, as I mentioned earlier, right? However, we ran into issues, and it was very difficult to kind of extend CK Pool. That's what we felt, just because it's in C, it's old school, and I mean, it does its job. It's an amazing piece of software, and it doesn't have too much test coverage, which I'm kind of really used to. If I make a change to a software, I'm like, okay, it doesn't work. I don't know till I actually take it to production. And it's someone else's code, so it's difficult to extend. So what we ended up doing is we had to build our own Stratum server, right? And which we've done that. So that's done. We also have the sharechain implementation in place, which basically takes the shares from the Stratum server and sends the shares over peer-to-peer network to other nodes, right? And if we've also done the IBD, which is like the initial sync of the chain. So a new node joins. And because we heavily prune in P2Pool, you don't need to maintain the entire history because old shares don't matter. So we're able to download the chain. So we're able to sync the chain. We also have the share validation done, the proof of work of the share validation done, and the difficulty adjustment done. So there's a fair few components done. However, the transaction engine remains, right? Which we know we can incorporate from Rust Bitcoin. We are using Rust Bitcoin anyway to validate the blocks and to validate the shares. So it's all happening. It's just that we haven't added the transaction support on the share chain. So I realistically think we're not that far. I'm kind of hoping for December, January MVP out there, like with without the atomic swaps. And that is on purpose, we're making that decision that we go launch with a limit of like 20 Coinbase outputs. So at least 20 people can come along and test. And we go for a testnet release come Christmas or New Year's. That is the personal motivation.
Excellent.
But let's see. This software is always like this.
Yeah. And what are you looking for? Like, do you want people to test? Are you looking for other developers, reviewers? Like, what are you looking for?
So we already have a test server up for the HydroPool component, which is like the solo instance, which tests the Stratum and the PPLNS payouts. So it's on test.hydropool.org, and people can point their machines. And some people have already been doing it because we want to make sure that the Stratum server works with different kinds of hardwares and this and that, the other. I was hoping that by the time of this podcast, I have the PPLNS up and we get to announce it together. But the PPLNS stuff is going to take another couple of weeks, I think, to get up on the test server. So this is just the centralized single node kind of test, right? But what I'm looking for essentially is, as Steve Ballmer famously said, developers. Have you seen that, right?
Yeah, there's like a famous meme of like they're kind of up on stage and they're like, developers, and they're kind of walking around. I think it was like the mid or late 90s or something. I can't remember when, but
yeah. We were all young then. So, I mean, we have there was a couple of really awesome students who came through Summer of Bitcoin. I'm trying to get them grants so that they can actually switch full-time or part-time to kind of continue contributing here, just because they've done an excellent job, and it's a pity to lose, people who've understood the problem, understood Bitcoin, to let them go do some Web 3.0 stuff. It's like, no, don't go there. So this is it. At the moment, I'm funded with OpenSats and 256 Foundation, so I have some runway, but I don't want to be developing alone, right? It was great over summer when we had these 2-3 guys. It'll be nice to get some more people looking at the code and testing, and we're going to reach out as the next stage of PPLNS testing is out there. We're going to reach out through Twitter and all the chat channels to kind of find.
And I guess in a loose sense, now, as you said, there's not one person hosting this. That's the point. It's P2P pooling V2. But in terms of, like, if you're thinking about normal pools, I guess the kind of rule of thumb is sort of once you get to like 1 or 2% hash rate of the network, now you're kind of quote unquote viable, because now you're going to get a payout like once a day ish on average. So I guess that's kind of zooming out. That's kind of the threshold you would like to hit, right? Like if you can get above that threshold, that's where it starts to be more viable. Yeah.
I'll be more humble, right? I basically would like to be able to, the problem with current testnet is that it's a bit busted. If the current testnet was around, it would be awesome to kind of at least test it a bit more. So we'll have to jump that. Ideally, testnet gets fixed and we are able to kind of prove for a few months working that we are able to get a certain amount of hash rate on testnet. I know that people who have put in a lot of money into mining don't want to point the hash rate to an untested pool. So we need to kind of prove along each step that we go that this is working. That's why we already set up the HydroPool testing server. Okay, look, Stratum works. Look, PPLNS works, right? So we need to keep getting that proof of working, proof that it is working out there continuously, right? So that there is trust on that software, basically. Just because, no single person runs it. The only thing you trust is software at that point. So the software better be working. Another thing to cover myself there is basically I'm a bit of a maniac for testing, and I'm trying to get the test coverage of the code base up above 90%, which we are still able to do. Sometimes you write a piece of code and you spend a day writing tests for it. Like the LLMs help, but still takes time. So it's at least good test coverage should give more confidence to that. Okay, look, this thing works as it claims.
Okay. Well, I think those are the key questions I had. I think this is an interesting project, interesting idea to help decentralize Bitcoin mining, as we spoke about. There were some of those early hurdles with P2Pool, but now the promise, the vision, the benefits would be non-custodial payouts and this idea of share accounting done in a decentralized way, and of course block template creation, meaning individual miners can pick what transactions go into their block template, which is also a decentralizing thing, instead of there being, let's say, centralized pool operators that nation state, government, regulators, bureaucrats could come to and say, hey, don't allow this into the chain, this kind of thing. So that's the promise. Jungly, where can people find you online if they want to learn more or support you somehow?
Okay, so Jungly on Twitter is easy, but on GitHub, if you look for P2Pool V2, that is where I'm kind of writing most of the stuff. The design decisions are on the wiki. The challenges are also all on the wiki. So all on the repo of P2Pool V2 on GitHub.
Fantastic. Well, links will be in the show notes. Jungly, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Stephan. Thanks a million.